不是说一模一样。So that's good. 他没有来。我刚才我这时候情侣很讨厌被当做。I'm just here for the book talk. I'm just here for the book talk. 对。你们就是有做一些快讯息。哦，对，我看到以前那个什么福瑞的那个，因为我还以为这是真的那个例子。这个培根有这边的一些不是说它是那个支持光所以要分享给别人。
So I come here just to see whoever to serves.
Yeah, 绘画。
But it's
Hello.
interesting.
我还以为是真的那个真性情，很像。对，我觉得那个有一真的。要跟那个公司少交一些，就是少交一些出街的课。
Testing. Okay, I think it's working. So thanks for coming today. I think we're going to start now. First, a bit about the space. This is Daybreak, which is a volunteer-run space founded by New Bloom magazine. We were founded in 2014 in the wake of the Sunfire movement. We were among the founders. And so we've been around for 10 years. We write daily on Taiwanese politics, social movements, activism. And a few years back, around 5 years ago, we started doing spaces. And so that's what eventually became this. And so today we have a joint book launch between myself and Wen. I guess I'll introduce myself first and then Wen can. So I'm Brian, and I'm one of the early members of New Bloom. I work as a freelance journalist. And yeah, I help out with space. That's mainly it.
Hello everyone, I'm also still the editor of New Bloom, and my name is Wen Liu, and I currently work as a researcher at Academia Sinica. So the book is actually my 10-year project, and we thought it'd be nice to do a joint book launch because they came out around the same time. Mine was May last year, and then Brian is this year, right? January, yeah.
Cool. So also there's more seats here. We're not scary, so if you want to come here. So I guess I'll present first a bit about what I wrote on. So it's kind of interesting doing this joint book launch because there are two very different kinds of books. Mine is fiction, but it's very much based on my life, so it's kind of auto-fiction. And so I was dealing with a period from 10 years ago with the Sunfire movement, the student-led occupation of the legislative branch in Taiwan, which is Taiwan's legislature, but also a period in time that was involving these many occupations that took place across the world. That was a time of Occupy Wall Street, also the Arab Spring, also the Indignados movement. And so I was trying to be interested in documenting that moment in time from the perspective of a young person. And while I wrote about it from my personal perspective, I also did a oral history project on the Sunfire movement where I interviewed 100 participants and wrote down their personal recollections and made an archive out of that. So that's the Daybreak project. So that's daybreak.newbloommag.net. And so with the name Taipei at Daybreak, it's one of the many times the term Daybreak has come up again. So Daybreak project documenting the Sunfire movement, Taipei at Daybreak, the book launch that we're launching today, and then Daybreak the space, which is a little confusing. So I thought about jokingly calling this Taipei at Daybreak, but not at daybreak, not the time, because it's a physical daybreak, but anyway. So what was the Sunfire movement? It was the month-long occupation of the Chinese legislature that was in protest of a trade agreement. That was a time in which the KMT, the former authoritarian party in Taiwan, had come back to power and was trying to push through trade agreements with China. And that led to concerns because it allowed for Chinese investment in Taiwan's service sector industry, which is 65% of the GDP. And so there's concern about China, but also took place in the same time, as I mentioned, of these different student movements. And so there was then concerns about that this was also a free trade agreement, that this was in line with global neoliberalism. And the youth movements then were very much also seeing themselves as part of this kind of larger trajectory. I think that is something that's faded a bit in time. But I think that for me, writing about it, and particularly in a first-person perspective, it was, when I was in my teenage or early 20s during those years. And so I was part of Occupy Wall Street, for example. I was also in Japan when the post-Fukushima anti-nuclear movement broke out. And that was the largest set of protests that occurred in Japan since the 1960s at that point in time, though they were later surpassed. And so there's this trajectory of movements, which I think has sort of been forgotten, because I think that a lot of the movements from the early 2010s have now been not as remembered as clearly, because particularly Taiwan is seen as having been successful, because Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP president, was elected in 2016, whereas, for example, Hong Kong, the umbrella movement the same year, went in a very different political trajectory, and that is not seen as successful. But then I think that what really forgets is that this trajectory in which, for example, young people across the world felt disempowered, and that the way to maybe reclaim what had been taken from them, or what older generations had that they did not, these opportunities or economic opportunities, or the sense of future being stolen, is something worth documenting. And so particularly with the book, which I don't know if anyone has read, because it's been out for about a month, I really try to capture that sense of lacking power and trying to struggle against the kind of constructing a social framework in that sense. And so what was interesting to me is that, particularly with regards to occupying the legislature, and that's not the only movement this book describes, but it does kind of culminate in that, or that is the focus of the book. It occurs around the midpoint of the book, actually. It was a way of reclaiming those government institutions that people had been denied kind of representation in. Sure, Taiwan's democracy, but what happens when you have a pro-China party that is attempting to undermine democratic institutions in power? And then beyond that, you could see echoes of that across the world. I mean, for example, Occupy Wall Street was occupying maybe not the legislature, but the financial institutions, literally Wall Street. And yet, I think what I observed in a lot of those movements was that, though I think it's often remembered as a kind of empowering moment for people, as though, again, in this triumphalist narrative of history, that young people really stood up for what they believed in, there's a sense of desperation really motivating people to take such dramatic action, actually, and a sense of having no future, as I mentioned, but also a lot of people who are outsiders and felt alienated from the world. And I think what happens in social movements often is that you encounter a lot of people that are actually quite alienated, and they're acting on some kind of sense of emotional dissatisfaction, which I think included myself. And so, I mean, if you read the novel, it's quite a very dark version of me that appears in that. And I think that's something I was very interested in getting at. And what I found is actually there's not a lot of social movement novels. Even the Sunflower Movement, which was this massive generational moment for Taiwan, it's only around 10 years later that people are writing fiction books about it. So there's another book, for example, The Becoming by Xu Enan, that came out also around this year. And it was actually kind of similar in the sense that it also talks about these things. For example, that social movements attract a lot of people who may not be in a mentally well place, for example. And a lot of the touch points in the book are very similar. For example, talking about, Japan, that also comes up. Okinawa specifically, and Okinawa's struggle for self-determination. And that's a bit different because it's written much more recent. And so, for example, Ukraine comes up. And there's a kind of flash forward in that book to the future in which, for example, the main character is a Taiwanese person outside of Taiwan has been destroyed by war as in Ukraine. Whereas my novel, by comparison or contrast, ends in 2016 because the way this was written was actually that I wrote it in the kind of 2016, 17, 18 period when I was doing my MA, but also doing the interviews for the Daybreak project. And then I wrote it, and it just sat on my desk for about a few years, and I turned 30, and I was like, oh, I should publish this. And so that's what led to be published. And I aimed for the 10-year anniversary of the Sunflower Movement, which was last year, and didn't make it, because publishing just takes a very long time. Even though the draft was turned in, that it could have perhaps made it for the 10-year anniversary. And so what is maybe interesting to think about for this is that particularly there's a wave of autobiographical fiction, I think, and generally, because I think a lot of people in the world just, I think any kind of fiction is derived from your own life experience, but then there's a moment in which people, I think, maybe because they're caught in the sense of not being part of a greater narrative history, that they've turned very much towards self-reflection. And for me, I really want to do something that was very different. I mean, writing about these historical moments, such as social movements. And I was actually a bit surprised that while I have a degree in literature, I couldn't actually find as much novels about social movements or revolutions as I thought there would be. And there are writing on that, or there are short stories that set in that. For example, I was very interested in Chinese revolutionary literature. That's what I did my master's on. But it's all from a very kind of personal perspective, and maybe that's also my book in some way. But then in reflecting on that moment, I mean, what does that do for the present? Because I think literature is one way in which history is documented. And this is not a memoir for, I think, a certain reason, because I think it was more interesting to write it as literature. I think it was more lasting kind of effect in that way. But also, then there's this kind of rise of Asian American literature, I think in the past 5 years, which is another trend that kind of surprised me, actually. These photos are basically just randomly for illustrative purposes. They have no real to do with anything I'm talking about. But I think that's what is interesting, is that there's this kind of moment in which there's a lot of focus on Asia. So part of my packaging of this novel as a Asian American coming of age story, as the back cover reads, is because of market considerations, honestly. But I think the other thing that is interesting is that, in another way, it is trying to intervene in this discourse, because I feel a lot of this writing on Asia, or about even Asian politics, is more Asian American politics, and not actually as much to do about Asia. So a book like Tao Lin's Taipei has nothing to do about Taipei. And then you have like Crazy Rich Asians, in which Singapore is a stand-in for this imagined version of China. Whereas I really wanted to write about Asia in that sense. And so Taipei is in the title because I felt it very much as a story that is set in Taipei, because of Taipei being the site of all these protests in the past decade, but also in previous decades as well. And some of the, there's a lot of references to Taiwanese, but also Chinese and Japanese literature engaging with this. For example, that a lot of the Taiwanese literature is overrepresented by mainlander literature from Taipei, which I think is problematic. And that many of the interlocutors for Taiwanese history have always been, Chinese and Japanese literature. And so it is trying to interject into that discourse to actually write about Asia, not just this frame projecting onto things. But what's interesting is that thinking about this as diasporic literature is that a lot of the historic representations of Taipei were also this kind of projection onto Taiwan that had very little to do with Taiwan. I'm thinking of Taipei People, for example, by Samuel, which in many ways I was reacting against. And I feel like that's also that sense of projection. So it is projection from diaspora, but also that also occurs within Taiwan. And that's another thing I was trying to think through. And I think that, next year. So I think that's another kind of issue that I was trying to think through. And I chose this picture because I think it is, I pull this picture up in basically any time I talk on the Sunflower Movement. It's the ROC flag upside down on the legislature. So it was this moment of inverted social order in some ways during the Sunflower Movement. I think that particularly, that's what really captured my attention and why I wanted to write about the Sunflower Movement. The original structure of the novel, for example, was actually very different than how it ended up, because originally it was an inverted order where it begins with the 2016 occupation of the Ministry of Education, then goes back to the kind of Occupy Wall Street period, and then culminates in the Sunflower Movement, because that was the kind of moment in which, for example, I thought a lot of these different historical threads came together, even if it was non-chronological. But I think that's also what captured me about social movements, and that's the reason why I've had an attraction to social movements, is because it shows the possibilities of what exists beyond this kind of current kind of ossifying capitalist framework. And I think that despite the messiness of social movements, and which is also something I really want to capture, because I think, again, there's too much just depiction of social movements that just glorify things, as though this is inherently liberatory in and of itself, when actually there's a lot of people there that are just trying to sublimate or excise their really negative emotions in movements. And that's also something I want to get at, this kind of messiness in that form. And so I guess I'll kind of leave it there, and we can kind of have more of a dialogue. But the book, I actually don't even know if it's really in Taiwan. I'm told today it's in Esli now, which is, I think, a good thing. It's on books.com.tw. Bookman is also ordering it. If you want to scan it, there's a QR code here. And if you want to, Bookman Books has physical copies, so you could also scan that. But anyway, you could also look it up online as well. And then I'll turn it over to Wen, and we can have more of a dialogue. Yeah, that's great.
So I think I'll stand because I have a kind of complicated PowerPoints. And I thought it was interesting because, I'm a Taiwan-born person who went to the US because, for education and studies, but Brian was born in the US, but then he writes about Taipei, and I was born in Taiwan and I write about Asian America. So we had this interesting, I think, identity switch when we were doing our project. So this book, it's weirdly positioned here.
You might have to hit the right on the keyboard.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like the right.
Oh, okay, got it. So this book is actually my dissertation project. So I started the work around 2014, and I studied psychology, and so a lot of things we pay attention to besides emotions, it's racial identity, it's belonging. And I always found it interesting about Asian American identity because it was a sort of adopted identity for me, and I thought something quite interesting between an immigrant and an Asian American person was not necessarily like our language skills or kind of our cultural sensitivity. Mostly it was actually around feeling. So I noticed a lot of my Asian American friends has a lot of suffering and repressed emotions. And what was really interesting about psychology is that in the social psychological lab, there wasn't this experiment about asking Asian American participant, where are you really from, right? I mean, as folks know, that's an insult, right, for Asian American, because when you're being asked that question, that meant that your identity as an American has been erased, right? But as an immigrant, someone who grew up in Taiwan, when I got asked that question, the immediate reaction was not defensive. It was like, oh, I'm from Taiwan, right? And as I, spent more time in the U.S., I started to feel and adopted that feeling of insult, right? So one incident was that I was teaching at State University of New York. I was a professor already, and then this white lady came to my office because she wanted to sell me books that I can teach in class. And after a really great 1-hour conversation, and then before she left, it's like, wow, you speak such good English. And that was the moment I feel like I almost became Asian American because I feel that insult. So I just wanted to talk about that because this is kind of my project. I think when we want to talk about Asian Americans, obviously we can talk about its internal diversity. There's a lot of different class structures, justification, etc. But a lot of it is about this concept I called racial injury. Oh, this one? So the paradoxical existence of Asian Americans is kind of how I started the book, and it doesn't appear 100%. Maybe okay. I know a lot of people don't like this Asian American columnist, Jaspian Khan, who's a writer for New York Times, but I do think something he said in his book, I think it's called The Loneliest American, was interesting. He says that there's actually no common history, no common language, no common culture about Asian Americans. So there's no Asian American food, right? There's no Asian American ancestor. It's all very diverse about the population. So can we really think about Asian American as a population? That's kind of his question. And that's also where I began my project, because I do think when we talk about Asian American, they're not a coherent racial group, yet we do think about Asian American racially, right? And so in my book, I talk about how they're made possible through the psychological race craft. So what it meant was that it was through decades of psychological study to kind of mold it and put a lot of cognitive meaning, emotional meaning, studies on trauma, etc., to kind of mold Asian American into a recognizable racial population. So a lot of my archive are actually talking about how psychologists understood Asian Americans. And as folks know, in social scientific studies, in humanity, there has been this affective term, right, in academia. So a lot of this new book, and people probably know Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and one of our good friends, Taiwanese American, Christopher Fun, who's teaching at University UC Irvine. He also writes about this super essential category of Asian. So what these authors have been talking about, we can no longer talk about Asian Americans strictly in racial terms. We have to think about this identity in an affective way. So Kathy Park Hong particularly talk about, right, the minor feelings of Asian American is you feel you're discriminated, right, but that type of feeling is not large, or you don't feel legible enough compared to other racial minorities. So that type of in-betweenness is, I think, a lot of the ethnicity study wanted to address. And this particular photo coming from the anti-Asian hate movement around, I think, 2021 and 2022 in the States was particularly, I think, inspiring for me. So this person who held a sign in, I think, New York in the park says, right, Chinese Exclusion Act 1882, Japanese internment 1942, and then Trump called us Kung Flu, right? Folks remember that was in the beginning of COVID-19, where a lot of Asian Americans were sort of being labeled, right, as a virus, etc., etc. And I think that type of thinking really resonates with a lot of people, particularly Asian American. But for me, I thought the narrative was really interesting because when you look at all these populations and the historical context, they're actually really, really different, right? And the type of kind of power dynamics that existed, in the Chinese Exclusion Act compared to, in World War II around Japanese internment camp, or the current type of U.S.-China conflict, we cannot use the same type of social political context to look at them. But to Asian American, that means a very streamlined or even linear kind of trajectory of what it means to be Asian American, right? So in a lot of the Asian American study class, we first learned about Chinese Exclusion Act. That was sort of the first moment of discrimination against Asian American, right? That's a narrative that's being talked about. So that is the idea of racial injury I'm trying to say. Because Asian Americans are not a coherent racial population, they need this kind of coherent feelings of injury to kind of tie them through the history. So to feel Asian American, I argue, is to feel the sense of connected racial injury. And also in Asian American study, we tend to think about these two kind of categories, right, or typologies of Asian American, from the earlier yellow pearl to model minority. And a lot of time we tend to talk about that as a linear way, right? We transcended from the yellow pearl, or to be discriminated or to be ostracized, to the 70s, right, model minority. But in a lot of newer literature, we've been talking about these typologies are actually not that different because they both embody the fear of Asianness, right, as an outside capital, alien capital, and anxiety around sort of Asian civilization, right, whether it's from trade, from the superior technical Orientalism and whatsoever. There are a lot of sort of similar lines between these typologies, so we cannot think about them as purely a linear advancement, but there are a lot of similar dynamics that happen in history, but also in the present. So in the book, I use these two concepts, racial flexibility, racial injury. So I want to argue that this type of racial flexibility where Asian American can portray themselves as super or hyper assimilable, right, to white culture, or very sort of racially oppressed. It's not a story from yellow pearl to model minority, but there's always assimilation and oppression at play at different historical times. So even when we talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, we tend to think about it's a completely ostracization of Chinese worker at that time. But when you look at the literature, what was interesting was that there was actually a lot of the Christian pastors wanted to keep Chinese workers in the US. So they were actually anti-Chinese Exclusion Act because they were sort of imagine that, Chinese compared to the Irish, biggest immigrant groups at the time, compared to blacks, compared to indigenous folks, the Chinese represented the more assimilable Christians or convertible Christian that they can use, right, to kind of promote their Christian ideology, because the Irish, right, they were Catholic, and the indigenous to them were not, quote unquote, civilized enough to become Christian. So Chinese at that time, right, were also sort of being situated in this assimilable, right, yet oppressed kind of category. So I was tracing a lot of these in-betweenness in different periods of history and how they're being used by psychologists. And another important thing I want to talk about is how this type of feelings of racial injury, and we all know that Asian American identity arose around, right, the 1960s, alongside Black Power movement. There's a lot of sort of radical revolt that happened at that time, all sort of united around this invisibility, right, this sense of racial injury. So racial injury can be mobilized for the left, for sure, But I think more and more present, particularly under neoliberalism, we see this type of racial injury feeling are mobilized by the right, right? We see students for fair admission, if folks know, right? A bunch of Chinese Indian parents suing Harvard and Ivy League school because they thought they were racially discriminated, right? By not getting into Harvard, because their kids' ACT score are perfect, but they were recruiting Black and Latinx kids, right? Or another my fieldwork talk about this particular case in New York where a Chinese American police, Peter Liang, who killed a Black man and on the job. And there were mobilization from the Chinese community to say, well, if you're charging this Chinese police guy, you are racially discriminated against all Asian Americans, right? While Black Lives Matter movement was going on, and a lot of the, I think, more liberal and second generation Asian Americans were pro the Black movement. So you see this conflict, right? How racial injury, can be mobilized by both ends. So these are just some of the typology I was using from, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? That they can be coolies, but also convertible Christians from World War II. We know that Japanese American, right? They were, putting into a lot of internment camps across U.S. countryside. But what was also interesting at that time, even though they were under a very harsh condition, these Japanese, sometimes they can get ticket to go to the town and go to the restaurant where Blacks could not go, right, under Jim Crow. So there's always that doubleness in different history. And in the more present time, folks probably have heard of this really popularized term microaggression, right? It's being used by psychologists to talk about particularly, right, this kind of Asian American feeling that we talked about, where are you really from? That's a kind of microaggressive assault. What I want to talk about is that the emergence of this term is kind of shows how psychology and our analysis of race has actually moved from a more structural and physical analysis of oppression, right, from segregation, from class stratification, and more to this unconscious feeling of racism. So anyone, anywhere can be racist, right? The subtle feeling of racism. And that type of analysis, while it's powerful, but it actually remove the kind of material basis of racism, which is, again, concerning. And in the more present time, particularly related to Taiwan, my last chapter I wanted to talk about this rise of tankism, which I think New Bloom, Brian, a lot of folks who are working on Asian democracy have really concerned about the rise of tankism, particularly I think among second generation Asian American folks, and I think the more left-wing circles in the U.S. And so, Child Collective is one, particularly became really popular during COVID time, right? They have tons of clicks on, Instagram and also on X at that time. And then you can see from their posts, they tend to sort of glorify, Maoism, glorify China. Some of the argument they made was, the U.S. so many people are suffering from COVID because of neoliberalism, and then look at China, they're doing so well. The state regulation works perfect for everyone, right? Such a, this the power of socialism, right? There's a lot of that argument, and then you also see how they look at Taiwan and Hong Kong. A lot of them really thought about Taiwan and Hong Kong, particularly after anti-ELAC movement, that they were completely influenced by CIA and all this democracy movement, which was what's called colored revolutions, right, from foreign influences. And my question was like, what happened, right? Why did these folks think this way, right? And I do think an important part of it was, again, the question of racial injury. So a lot of these second generation Asian American folks, they did feel being discriminated, right? When they were in the U.S. So when they grew up, they thought about, right, this idea of American imperialism is, supreme, it's evil, right? It's bad for third world people. But rather than doing an objective analysis of that, they also want that feelings of loss, right? I was born in the U.S., but the U.S. hates me because I have a person of color. And that feelings of loss are being projected onto another love object, right? The powerful other, which they adore as what they wanted to project onto the rise of China as a sort of a way to resolve their racial melancholia. So in the last chapter, I write about when we talk about Tankism, it is a form of diasporic Chinese nationalism, as Brian has written many times. It is also a racial relation because they tend to look at the white Asian domination we saw in the West or everywhere as something that we can kind of compare to US-China domination, right? It's kind of white supremacies over China as a third world country. So in my analyses, I don't know if it's okay, clear. So I just want to show how, particularly I think after 1960s, there's a lot of analysis between the so-called assimilationists and counter identificationists. So those who Asian American who just want to become white, right? Or those who are against being white, right? And are anti-US nationalism and wanted to find some other kind of identity to believe in. But there's maybe another way out, particularly through a lot of the transnational movement across Hong Kong, Taiwan, East Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. And then I use queer theories, right, Mouno's term of this identification. So you can be against US imperialism, but you don't have to kind of project that feeling of loss or disagreement onto a new form of nationalism, right? You can find some other things, right, to attach to. So I do think there's we can find a slight differences between those who just want to be anti-American versus those who can find different types of solidarity in the transnational. So I do want to kind of plug in for organizations that really look at these more dynamics in a more nuanced way, right? I think New Bloom is one of them, and also Lao San, which is a group in Hong Kong that we really connected to. And around 2020, right, there was a digital sort of what's it called, like a conference called Transnationally Asian, right? Mostly a lot of people who have been in the US, diasporic activist folks, second generation Asian Americans who do have disagreement with the US, but also understand that Asia has its own type of democracy and governance, and we can't just use that kind of racial lens to look at US and Chinese relations. So there's kind of new type of kind of minor to minor, is not showing up, but minor to minor transnationalism, right? That that they're united together against the rise of global authoritarian order, rather than just seeking a new love object of China, right, to identify to. So, so my book, in a way, I think wanted to talk about Asian Americanness, not only in the way of racial analyses, but also bring in kind of the lens of geopolitics, because as folks know, in the US, right, Asian American study tend to only focus on whatever happened in the US itself, and then Asian study tend to only focus on whatever happened in Asia, and doesn't look at race. So we need to think about kind of race and geopolitics, in a more intersectional way. So that's what the book tries to do. So yeah, that's me for now. Thank you. Do you want to react? Or?
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that, of course, writing about Hioe and so forth, I mean, we saw the kind of antecedents of that, particularly. I mean, there are a lot of people in the audience here around for the Vietnam protests in New York, for example. For example, I remember that there was one time you, me, and Mike were there, and there's a band, and they started off playing the Chinese national anthem, and they realized they're playing the wrong anthem, it's supposed to be the US national anthem. And then that's like in, what year? 2018? 17?
No.
No, that's even before
14.
14 or 15. So actually that's like, yeah, very much before the present. But that points to a lot of these complicated dynamics in present. And there was one time when I was listening in one of these Hioe webinars, and the speaker was just at odds to explain his own existence as a Chinese American, because he was saying that China is so great, it's such utopia, but at the same time, I'm so privileged to be here in America, and my parents immigrated here. And it's like, okay, well, if China was so bad, or so great, why did your parents ever want to leave it and come here? So why do you exist? And I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me in looking at Asian American literature, is that people are often searching for a genesis narrative, a way to explain their own existence and raison d'etre in that sense. And I think for me, when I was writing on this, I wanted to kind of like deconstruct it, because for me, my protagonist in that, which the background I changed a bit to make it less complicated, because my background is a little more complicated, is like, someone descended from the KMT, for example, not having a heritage that you can be proud of, what if you are descended from, people who are like war criminals and committed ethnic cleansing? Because not every diaspora story will be one of empowerment, of having ancestors you can long after and find, glorious in that way. And I think that's precisely the point, because I also do think that diasporic politics have a point of possibility for liberatory politics, but is not the kind of idealization of ancestors and looking for a genesis narrative that just kind of builds up this coherent sense of identity for people who are always navigating this boundary between themselves as Asian, themselves as American, but maybe actually rejecting nationalism altogether, just knowing the premises of being between that. So there's one line in my novel where the protagonist says, well, I'm not Taiwanese, I'm like rejecting both. I have the space in between the Taiwanese and American on the page, like the blank of that. But then I think also the other thing I want to do is that there's the kind of flip side, which is a lot of diaspora writing, which is very much like melancholy and reflective and writes about fruit and just like that kind of bad parody of diaspora poetry. And I felt like there's also a critique of that, is just mining out the kind of trauma of ancestors that you never experienced yourself in order to have something to write about or have a coherent subject or build your subject around. And so that's something else I was trying to do, which is get beyond that, which is by having a protagonist or maybe me myself going to actually places in which there are political things happening and experiencing that for myself. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the problem, right? Because a lot of the Asian American study was kind of situated that type of nostalgia and loss, and then the question is always, then what else, right? And so Asian American identity becomes, I think, a holder for a lot of these type of feeling, right? So you wanted to make Asian Americans strong, but then in a way, right, as Wendy Brown talks about, sometimes it can be a wounded attachment, right? If you trying to hold on to this identity, but when the identity itself, there's too much internal disagreement and stratification, what does it really mean to be Asian American today, right? So we know in in a more kind of demographic sense, Asian American community had the largest class stratification compared to all other ethnic groups, right? So when we look at family income, first of all, they're rated the highest, but they also have the most kind of internal divide in terms of class income. And I think another data that was interesting is that a lot of these theories on Asian American politics really came out around the 60s, where the majority were born in the States, right? But now it's completely on the flip side, right? Around 70% of Asian Americans were actually born outside of the States. So you get even a much more transnational picture, and also kind of different national feelings of affiliation and belonging in the current generation of Asian Americans. So can we really use the same type of theory of Asian Americanness from the 60s? I do think it needs some changes, right? If we don't change that, you see a lot of Asian American study class are still very attached to that type of third worldism, right? That Afro-Asian solidarity, third world revolt. But what happened was that a lot of the contents of what they talked about, whether it's Chinese and blackness, as Maoism, it's all becoming, I think, super confusing, right, in today's time, right? Particularly if you want to go, put it into analyses of China in the current state of Asian regional politics. We cannot use the same framework, in the 60s. So my question was always, then I always get that question, like, then what is the future of Asian American? And I say, I see the future of Asian American, a lot of them are in Asia. But I don't know, what about Asian Americans in the States, right? What should be the politics then? And I know a lot of my more kind of radical Asian American colleagues, they do talk about black politics and the kind of politics that you don't put your identity as the primary framework. Because once you put your identity as a primary framework, you get a lot of really uncomfortable thing, I think, with other racial groups. So I do think this is a difficult question, and I no longer live in the States. I don't know how that feels anymore, but I do think that's a question that I think a lot of Asian Americans are struggling now.
Yeah, there's something else I wanted to ask about, because I think particularly with us here now in Asia, but a lot of times, when we were, I think, writing on Qiao and going after them, a lot of us were in the US, and so there's been a shift which really happened after COVID. But I think what's also interesting is that, particularly when I observe a lot of Asian Americans, they treat Asia as a kind of static entity, as though it's like the long for essentialist, origin that doesn't change. But in reality, for example, let's say academia here is actually very often influenced by Western theory, and they're always importing Western theorists. You get the various schools of thought in Taiwan that bring over some fancy Western theorist to say the things they want them to say, and then see, look at this great Western theorist. Even when those groups claim to be post-colonial or third worldist or left in that sense, they're still actually very dependent on Western theory. And then I think that's a dynamic that many Asian Americans maybe don't understand, and that's actually one of the interesting phenomena since then, since our polemics against Hioe, is I've seen that discourse now filter back to Taiwan through those people, through people translating this, people that actually don't know a lot about Asia and using them as, because they're superior cultural capital, as being from the West in that sense. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, like what is, because this it's a lot that's changed actually.
Yeah. So what you said really remind me of something. So there is a tradition of Asian American studies in Taiwan in the 1990s. But what was interesting about that, it was mostly 外省人 nostalgia, right, for people who left China. So they do see this connection between 外省人 who left China and moved to the US or elsewhere in Europe or Southeast Asia, and Asian American, right? Particularly, I think the literature that happened before the 1990s. I mean, today was totally different because you get such diverse and also a lot of Taiwanese American out there. But prior to that, it was mostly Chinese Americans, right, who wrote about the laws of the culture of China. So I do think there's a very strong connection, right, on the sense of loss, particularly on China, and the kind of desire, right, to look for where can their ideal China be if not in the current PRC, right? So I do think that question is still in the cultural studies, particularly in Taiwan, that we have some scholars who are still kind of longing for that kind of rhetoric, right? Particularly, I think inter-Asia is another term to replace this longing for China, but they use inter-Asia, right?
Asia's method.
Yeah, Asia is a method, right?
Against China.
In the thought. Yeah, so I do think they still have quite a lot of influences here, but also because that type of rhetoric can be understood immediately as radical in the West, right? So there's a high, connection, right? People read it as, oh, that must be high theory, right? So I think that's the frustration that we get as someone, I think, who really looks at local Taiwanese politics more. And I don't have a solution, but I just know there's obviously a lot of the transnational linkage that we can't just criticize, these type of thoughts here. We also need to criticize them in the States because they're both connected.
Yeah, you want to open up to Q&A?
Yeah.
I think people just might need to raise hands and talk a bit loudly. Normally I go around the mic, but I'm sitting here, so it's not gonna work. Yeah.
Yes.
You're pointing at me. Okay. I have two questions for you. One is some of this, what you just alluded to, so like Western longing for an imagined China, and the Child Collective kind of also longing for an imagined China, and then a lot of Western scholars, even those of like Asian extraction, also like longing for a different version of Asia. And like if you go on the Child Collective, like look at Twitter once and it went down like this dark hole, a lot of all of this is divorced from facts. So I'm curious if you can explain that, especially because I'm not an academic. But number two, I was an Asian American Studies major in college at UC Davis, and now I'm an Asian American, living and working in Asia. And so, back then there was such a, it was like American with like an exclamation mark in any mention of transnationalism. People would kind of be almost offended because it was very much about like making sure that Asian Americans were situated in this larger social justice struggle of Black Americans, etc. But today, in today's geopolitics, that is not enough to explain what's going on. So I was wondering how people responded to you in terms of trying to put a transnational lens that's applicable to today's reality.
So I'll leave the child question to Brian. Yeah, it's interesting because when I was writing the book, I was in the U.S., but when the book was published, I moved back to Taiwan. Like the book publishing process took like 5 years, right? And in my sense, like Asian American study has also transformed a lot. Particularly in early 2000, there's people who start writing about diaspora as a new kind of conception and paradigm. And also because the changes in Asian American itself, as I talked about, right? These scholars noticed that their students more and more were not born in the States anymore. They're coming from different places. As we see, like the growth of Korean studies, Filipino studies is really show the diversification of Asian America itself. So I do think diaspora is kind of a very acceptable term in Asian American studies now, but I think the primary analysis of Asian America is still racial identity and anti-US imperialism, right? So those two, I do think you can still see from a lot of scholars' work. But I think the new addition recently I noticed is people wanted to go outside of kind of the white, Asian, black triangulation and kind of moving in questions on indigeneity and on diaspora, right? So it becomes even more complicated, and the questions on Asian America was sort of this alien capital really became something I think quite interesting in Asian American studies itself, and also the rise of the techno-oriental regime in Asia. So that's kind of folks' mind now. So there's definitely a much more transnational focus. But how much do they want to criticize anti-US imperialism like US in the '60s? I put that in a question mark because I think people still are very uncomfortable with reconcile with any type of critique outside of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting question for me, is that has diaspora as a category kind of lost productivity? Because now it's become very ossified, very reified, whereas in the past it was very, very deterritorialized, shifting, pointing to crevices and spaces between identities that are seen as static. In that sense, dynamic. But then now it's become this kind of atavistic, longing for a essentialist sense of identity, and that's, I think, problematic. And so Hioe is precisely that. But I think the other reason why they just don't know things about China is because they are tourists. And so, for example, from a Taiwanese or Chinese American perspective, for a long time I was very frustrated with food writing on Taiwan. Now we have good food writing. But in the past it was just night markets, beef noodles, Luro fan. And Hioe, when they go to China, that's also what they see, because they just go to those places. They only see a certain side of China. It's a side that they have access to, or if they actually, because now they do have collaborations with the state, they see a very kind of small bubble, an echo chamber, where they see what they want to see and not what is actually unfiltered. And so, I think that maybe what I was trying to argue with my novel is that maybe you should go there and participate in the struggles and see that things are actually quite ugly. And this is how people live, and there's struggles, and there's nothing to be idealized that, there's nothing to be looked down upon, it's just life. And I think that's what it is, because Asia is a place, and that's, I think, what Asian Americans need to understand. But then I think that rupturing that bubble is very hard, because people are looking for, particularly in the face of American racism, a kind of thing they can draw on as a sense of hope or kind of strength, actually. And actually, as time has gone on, though I still have these very sharp critiques of them, I kind of feel much more bad for Hioe Collective and a lot of my tanky nemesis, because I feel like maybe they need to work through their issues. Maybe they should see therapy.
Just want to add something on that, because I do think Hioe is like the epitome of this phenomenon we see in Asian American studies, where, as we talked about, right, the primacy of analysis on anti-US imperialism and then racial identity is that any critiques of China becomes racist, right? And I do think a lot of the more liberal-leaning folks are worried about that type of, I don't know how to call it, like, a discursive backlash, right? If you are very anti-China, right, then you must be a racist or you're a race traitor, et cetera, et cetera. So the outside of those kind of two primary analyses, like, can you add in something more complicated than that? And we also see Chinese government is, they are really good at utilizing that, particularly around Black Lives Matter, right? The Chinese propaganda from the state would say, we use this kind of whataboutism, right? Look at the U.S. It's an imperial country. They're bad, bad at their black people, right? Their police are killing blacks. So you can't criticize us for the issues in Tibet, in Xinjiang, or the police, abuse in Hong Kong. And we see that in a lot of, I think, critical circles in academia, right? I was a board member in, women's studies in the U.S. And we want them to kind of issue a statement to support Hong Kong. But they were just saying, well, how can we criticize the police in Hong Kong when, the US has police doing these things to, people of color communities? So I do think there's that kind of barrier, right, from particularly this more kind of left-leaning academic circles to criticize China. And Hioe is just, I think, one of the more extreme form of that.
A quick point on that, I mean, when Hioe, for example, says that criticizing China is racist, that's actually a fundamentally American perspective, because then you're not thinking from the perspective that every place is racist, every place has some kind of racism and nationalism in name. So that is fundamentally thinking from the point of perspective of America, but they have this longing to be kind of unadulterated Asian, I think. And I think that is an interesting thing, but their perspective is still that. And then I think that particularly for the US, there's still this difficulty actually of seeing Asia as a place. It's not the other of the US that is operating by a fundamentally different logic. It is just a place in the world, with its own internal dynamic and logic, but sure, but it's still a place. Yeah. Next question? Yeah, back there.
Yeah, yeah, go for it. You.
I just wanted to circle back to this idea of category construction. I guess specifically as regards feeling Asian American, but I think it maybe applies to both books too. I think often in the US, when we see or use this term Asian American, it's often conflated with East Asian American identity, or even specifically Chinese identity. And there's a lot of kind of categorical tensions there, as you kind of pointed out with this idea of, can we consider this a coherent category? But then I think it's political mobilization in an era of geopolitical tensions between the US and China is really interesting, especially when Asian American as a category encompasses so much diversity and so many kind of identities and backgrounds beyond simply Chinese backgrounds. So I'm curious if the book addresses that from any kind of particularly theoretical standpoint, or how, from a fictional perspective and an academic perspective, maybe you would tackle that question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think it's actually one of those things to think about, because who is that creates knowledge in theoretical frameworks? It's often people have the most privilege in the room. And so even among minority categories, quote unquote. And so we talked a bit about, for example, Weisheng creating a lot of these categories. And that's something I really want to engage with in my novel as well, because it is those people that have created that perspective. And actually for me, what's interesting is that someone pointed out to me a while ago that my critique of the Tiao Collective is basically derived from my critique of the Taiwanese prounification left. It's the same critique, because these are Taiwanese people who have this longing for China, and it ended up being basically the same longing that the Tiao Collective as Chinese Americans have for China. But then I think that, people don't pay attention. There's a great moment in which, for example, Tiao denied that Singaporean has discrimination against non-Chinese, like Singapore. And they were ratioed by Singaporeans. So that's something that happened. And I think there's this lack of attention to that. I think that particularly that's something that Asian American studies needs to work through if this is a category. Who is it that comes up with knowledge? And even it's not just that all minority groups or whatever, it's flattening things out, etc. There's a lot of terrain to be worked through there.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I do think Asian American, there's a primacy of ethnicity, definitely Chinese. People tend to equate Asian American just as Chinese American. But I do think things are changing. Things are changing because the category itself has become more and more diversified. But I think in the book, I try to address that even though there is so much diversity. But the point is not about talking about how diverse Asian American category is, because a lot of these kind of more liberal-leaning authors would say, well, yeah, Asian Americans are not all the same. We're not all middle class. And we have Southeast East Asian American groups. We have folks from the refugee community. But all those things were just kind of adding up to again the same category that they wanted to represent something, right, to the mainstream society, white population. So the point I was trying to say is that what unites Asian American identity cannot be any of these things. It cannot be race, it cannot be class. You can try to argue for that, but it will never work because it's just too diverse, right? So we can only come from a more kind of affective analyses and say, so what has been consistent, and what is a primarily driven force that unite those who want to stay in this category? Because you do see for a lot of these Southeast Asian American group, they actually wanted to leave the category, right? That in California, Southeast Asian group tried to say that we don't want to be put in the same census as East Asian group, right? Because when we're being put together, our education mark, our family income mark would misrepresent us, right? So you have a lot of these groups who will just say Asian American as a category just doesn't work for us anymore, right? It doesn't really measure the thing we want to measure. So I think rather than trying to complicate this category and say, no, we can encompass all Asian ethnicity, we might as well just recognize it has a very specific history, a sense of feeling, and it has been dominated mostly by, the East Asian elites who are using that for the leverage, in Washington D.C. politics, in Ivy League school, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at some point, I don't know if that means a complete destruction of the category, probably not, but to recognize the limit, I think is also important. Yeah.
Hi guys. So my question is this. It actually pushes on a little bit of what you were saying. I'm quite curious, as to how Asian Americans in the way that you both sort of conceptualize it, especially you. Yes, it's this sort of Northeast. It has this sort of Northeast Asian basis, but then how are South Asians or Southeast Asians in the United States sort of seen by this sort of default Northeast Asian sort of view? I mean, just as a point of reference, when we talk about British Asians, right? They could very clearly talk about South Asians there too. And the sort of second question that I wanted to ask is, I'm wondering then how if you both sort of looked at the receptions and responses to this Asian American perspective, because as a Singaporean, I also find that often, there's this railing against anti-imperialism, but then a lot of these Asian American perspectives get pushed onto people in Asia. You have to sort of accept their sort of categorization, what Asia is, which is in itself sort of imperial. And they say this because they are in a position of privilege. They are citizens of a very powerful country. So I'm wondering how that side of the dynamic works in your observation, since especially if you're both in Taiwan now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have to think more. But in my understanding, South Asian group tend to also want to move away from Asian Americanness because they do think it's really represented mostly by Northeast Asian groups. So, particularly in psychology, we see a lot of the scholarship. If they talk about Asian Americans, if they talk about South Asian American, it tends to be its own categories and it has own kind of interests and questions. So, and when you look at Asian American, and particularly Northeast Asian American group, it tends to talk about mental health issue, parent generation conflict, right, the second generation problem, cultural issue, linguistic adaptation. But then when we look at South Asian group, I think it's a different concern, and the questions of religion is often added into it, right? So I think there is a difference in categorization. And the second question, yeah, I definitely agree. So how we understood Asian Americans and the values, right, you presented tend to be imposed on all Asian groups, right? So it is very transnational. So in my book, I talk about the conception of Asian Americanness in the U.S. in the 1970s. People tend to think about it as a post-1965 immigration reform. I do think that's a really big issue because you have a lot of middle-class Asians now in the U.S. and they can be more powerful, have some kind of discursive power, et cetera, but also the start of APEC and a lot of kind of post-World War II Asian organization in Asia, I think really solidified the idea of pan-ethnic Asianness. That's not often talked about, in North American context. So I think there is some mutual influences transnationally. I mean, that's my observation.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer to the first question, but I also do think that particularly groups like Tiao like to paper over those differences because for them it's a way to really bolster their own credentials to speak or have a platform to speak. Because, for example, even if it covers over other groups, they have their moment to the sun now. So, for example, they'll never talk about India-China tensions today. They'll just paper that over completely. Or they'll never talk about that for literally centuries, millennia. Southeast Asia has feared Chinese empires of various iterations of Chinese empires. But then I also think maybe the category of Asian American that is more discourse, it's more mature. Maybe vision is actually not a bad thing if there can be productive differences made in that sense. And there's still solidarity, but then there's more fleshing out of these different categories. As for the second question, as I kind of work more particularly with civil society groups regionally, what I find is a very interesting dynamic with diaspora that are in this space is that they have much more privilege and capacity to speak and can gain access to international institutions more easily, which I include myself in this category, because they speak English better with a certain accent and have certain ways of habitus of interacting in certain spaces. And then there are flip sides to that. One is that then local actors, when they get kind of covered over or by these people, but then also that can be for particularly disenfranchised groups a way to have more space because of the fact that maybe they have no other spokespersons. And so it's a double-edged sword, and I actually find myself frequently navigating that. Not even working with anything to do with the Taiwan or China or Hong Kong space at all, but particularly because I work with a lot of groups in Southeast Asia, just as a participant and working, seeing other groups in which basically there's some spokesperson that's very, very diaspora and actually is very disconnected with what's happening, but then is the one getting all the speaking opportunities. I see that dynamic. It's quite important to note, I think. Yeah. Next question?
Sort of bounce off on that. I'm wondering if some of these Asian American academics or people who have voices are even aware of the privilege. It's actually the first time I've heard that, but using the word of the privilege. But because it's like that, all of that kind of completely with James House but do you have any answers to that? Are they even aware of this? Because I think
Yeah, I guess to respond to that first, it depends, but I think the other thing is that privilege can also be a justification for actually power-seeking activity. And so people always claim to be the most disprivileged group when actually there are more disprivileged groups. And then because you really want that moment in the sun, you want that speaking platform or whatever. And so I think the check your own privilege thing, it really applies universally. But then I think it's gone in the wrong direction sometimes, where people really try to claim the position of being the most depressed, depression monkeys, as they say, to have the most privilege, actually.
Yeah, I think a really paradoxical moment was around anti-Asian hate time, and then there were diasporic Asian Americans in Taiwan, because it was COVID, right, organizing a march against the Asian hate thing. And what was interesting is that, I mean, I participated in the march as well, but then you see upper middle class, American, Asian American people, very professional people, right, talking about how oppressed they are. But that becomes really awkward, right, in the space of Taipei, where they're definitely not the most oppressed Asians, right? But the idea that because there is transnational linkage, that you can use this anti-Asian hate in the context to represent your racial injury as an Asian American, I think, to me, that becomes so such an oxymoron, right? That do you recognize that Asian hate in Taiwan could mean different things, or there are other kind of racial oppressions and hierarchies also in Taipei, right? So I do think that's something as the Asian American privilege that needs to recognize is the moments like that, yeah.
Yeah, maybe to back off of that, I think what still really strikes me is that when you tell, let's say, Qiao Collective that, wait, you realize Han people are the majority in China, and you say some, banal equivalents like, wait, you realize you're the white people of China, right? That breaks their minds. So somehow it's still very difficult. But then I also think that even for people that are maybe ethnically the same group, where you grew up and what cultural capital you had access to, that still reflects very different level of privilege. And a lot of Asian Americans maybe in Asia don't always want to open that wormhole either, because that really, again, makes them question their sense of identity when they're really trying to build a very stable subject, again, genesis narrative for themselves that doesn't make them question themselves. Yeah. Okay.
I recently came across a book called Unassimilable that is about, it suggests or questions this type of idea of specifically Asian Americans assimilating into American society and whether that's necessary. And I think there's often this narrative about like the good immigrants and the bad immigrants, and in order to be a good immigrant you have to assimilate. So I'd be curious, especially since Brian, your book also talks about your own experiences coming to Taiwan and kind of, going between these type of expat communities and the local communities. So I'd be curious to hear about your opinion of like this pressures to assimilate in the American context and perhaps also the differences to Taiwan.
I guess I'll respond to that first. First, my book, I did change the background of and experiences like particularly early on in Taiwan like a great deal, because I thought actually it worked better to have a narrative in which the protagonist is very like, I don't know, it's kind of, I thought it would actually just make better drama in some sense. But then I think that is a concern. I think that particularly citizenship is often a category that people then deal with. Again, good citizenship, bad citizenship. model minority, and there's a way to get it's still oriented towards trying to belong in society, and society is inherently never homogeneous. It's always heterogeneous, and so I think that's something to worth keeping in mind. I mean, I think it's always going to exist, that kind of dynamic, I think, because as long as a nation state exists and citizenship as a regime or boundaries exist, I think that's always going to be the case. But then, there's a need to trouble that, of course. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Yeah.
I have one more, but if anyone else, because I already asked one. I'm really interested in this kind of conversation about nostalgia and how it kind of functions politically to, in some senses, create a stable identity that is in many ways unlinked from political movements, kind of in a variety of contexts. And I'm interested in that specifically in the context of fiction and diaspora fiction. Because nostalgia obviously also has, in a literary sense, very affective properties that can be, in many ways, something that invites the reader into a story in certain ways. Is there a function for nostalgia in these narratives that doesn't do the political work of maybe papering over truths that people don't wish to address? Or if that's not possible, is there a future for these narratives that gets beyond nostalgia and the kind of political truths it obscures and goes in a different direction to really engage more substantially with politics, both, in the US and in other contexts?
Yeah, I guess I can respond first. I think nostalgia is a category I've always found really troubling, because I think, at least for diaspora fiction, a lot of it is nostalgia for things people never experienced themselves, nostalgia for imagined paths. And I think that the thing, though, is that it's very easy to, as an abstraction for political mobilization, nostalgia. It's very effectively, because as a form of affect, because it's very easy to appeal to this imagined past, rather than some vision of a future that you've never seen, but may want to will it into existence. And so I actually don't know either. I find it very troubling, though. So I think that's the thing I was trying to, in my novel, it's like there's nothing to be long for. The past is just bad. History is bad. It's all just tragedy. That basically, there's no positive past to long for. It's all just this history of, nation state versus nation state, of death and war and etc. And that's actually what people are looking at and romanticizing somehow when they look at kind of their own past, actually. And so, I think for me, as someone that's descended from the KMT, it's easier to kind of link to that. Maybe my ancestors did not have a background that is anything to be proud of, and so there's that. But then, even if you have, let's say, you're descended from some revolutionary, that doesn't mean you're a hero today. There were protests, for example, in Bangladesh against the people that are descended from the revolutionaries that now have a lot of privilege because that was enshrined in the political system after that. Those kind of things happen. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much I could respond to that, but I immediately thought about this film called Joyride. I don't know if folks have seen it. So it's kind of a playback, right, to Joy Luck Club, right, which is, I think, a novel but also a movie completely kind of situated on 3 generations of trauma of Chinese immigrant, Chinese women, right, and this nostalgia of a place that they can no longer go back. And Joyride, really interesting, it's a comedy, right? It's 4 young Asian American women, and then one of the main protagonists always thought she's Chinese American, but then went to China, wanted to live for her family, and then turned out she's actually Korean adoptee, right? So in a moment of revelation, like her entire narrative of identity just crashed, right? These things she longed for no longer exist. But it turned out to be great, actually. It turned out to be liberating for this protagonist. So I do think that is this kind of new genre of Asian American movies, or even talk about Netflix beef, right? That there's a lot of anger, class resentment, but there's no nostalgia in it, right? There's a lot of imagination and healing. So I do think there's something's changing in the Asian American creative production that's no longer only kind of mobilizing nostalgia in that sense. And I wanted to say something else about nostalgia, but I forgot now. But yeah, but thanks for the question. If it comes back.
Yeah, I was thinking about the magnitude model hypothesis that in a way that to divide the idea of dividing social race, the theorists of biological race also put Chinese people Asian people in the middle of white and black people. I was thinking about how can transnationalism become more internationalism in the way that I was thinking about how in Gaza situation now you have a lot of Jewish anti-Zionists that think about their position as Jewish and how their Jewish identity has been abolished by the creation of a state nation as Israel. And I was thinking how the diasporic identity can be a way to define the feeling of the Asian American as not only being privileged as a minority voter, but more as a key of partnership with anti-racist movements and anti-imperialist movements. How this feeling can of diasporic feeling can restrict the aliens. How the history also mobilized how the trauma mobilized can be linked to Black Lives Matter movements in America. I don't know if clear.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I think one of the my book most engaged was with the sociologist Korean American called Claire Jean Kim, and she had this really famous model talking about Asian American racial identity as racial triangulation, right? And my major critique of that framework was that she thought the difference between Asian American and Black Americans was that Asian Americans face civic ostracism. So because they're foreigners, they're being discriminated. So even though it's not comparable to Blacks, but because that they were always seen as perpetual foreigner, so that's how they're being discriminated. But I do think, okay, that's partially true, but it doesn't recognize how, I think to a lot of Asian Americans, particularly in this particular generation, foreigners does not necessarily mean disadvantages, right? Particularly when you look at the rise of Asian capital and transnational flows of capital and, right, crazy rich Asia was seen as even more rich, right, than the US. So this Asian American professor, when she went to Singapore, she became kind of too, right? Because she never thought that, oh, no, Asia was actually so rich. So the question is that, you know, the type of transnationalism that was analyzed before in the racial comparison model was always thought as bad as the way that Asians were discriminated, but it could also actually be their privilege in some way. And to your point, the privilege can also be, I think, the way that Asian American can extend allyship transnationally, right, to different types of struggle, to Palestinian solidarity movement, to democracy movement in Asia, etc. So transnationalism does not have to always be theorized in the kind of perpetual foreigner way, which Asian American study tended to do. So I do think when we look at, if we recognize that Asian American is always already transnational, there's actually so much we can do in terms of allyship and kind of solidarity building. So I mean, that's my, what I thought coming from the comment.
Yeah, I think I don't have an answer to how to build an internationalist politics, but it's very hard to find a way to politically mobilize and connect, I guess, across all these different borders. But maybe that is a challenge. I think the struggle of being Asian American is often this, again, attempt to create a coherent subject that is, you're caught between being Asian, you're caught between American, and then it resolves in some way. And it's not particular to Asian American because there are many diasporic categories. It's just Asian American because America's place in the world, maybe, or maybe because Asia is, the global majority or whatever, is such a influential one worldwide. But I think that maybe what is more productive is actually that there's this unresolvable void you're trying to fill because we're caught in this thing which is the nation state. And maybe the point is actually the void and to embrace that you're not going to have a coherent subject. And maybe that's the way for thinking out of, the nation state as historical form, which I think is historically the barrier to, international organizing. Because whenever there are attempts to create political alliances or coalitions, they usually fail because nationalism takes precedent eventually. Yeah. Maybe like last round. Any other questions? Last question? Or not? Okay. I guess we can close it there, and we can just chat casually. All right, next everybody. And so we'll it's entirely volunteer run here. So if you like to buy a drink, that really helps keep us live. And your book is available online?
Online, yeah. Kindle.
Yeah, just mine. So
Yeah.
yeah, where books are found. So yeah, very nice, everybody.
Yes, or she would have first, but one of yeah, we're in the same club. Yeah.
You're about to start at NTM. With like overall, okay.